The ocean stretched black as ink beneath a scowling moon, its dim light struggling to penetrate the thickening fog. The Black Talon sliced through the waves, her midnight sails billowing with the promise of peril ahead. At her helm stood Captain Draven Silas, a man of storm-colored eyes and a gaze that could cut through steel. Beside him, his first mate, Lena Aris, braced herself against the sea spray, her wary eyes fixed on the shadow-laden horizon. Tonight, they sailed toward the last point on an old, frayed map, a place spoken of in whispered legends, the Isle of Shadows. Rumor held the island to be cursed, a land that promised boundless riches yet harbored secrets older than memory itself. Some said it was once the kingdom of a great sea king who fell into darkness, binding his power to the land and dragging all who dared to enter into his nightmare. Others spoke of shadowed figures who walked without souls, bound to guard a treasure even the devil himself would envy. Draven didn't heed the tales. He had seen maps of the island pass from hand to hand in the shadowed inns of Port Corazon, where fear-stricken whispers shared the warnings. Yet no one had dared seek it except Draven. He carried the last remaining copy of the map to the Isle of Shadows, the promise of boundless wealth burning brighter in his mind than any warning could extinguish. After all, he was no ordinary pirate. Draven Silas was a man whose daring bordered on madness. "Look lively, crew," he barked, his voice a sharp contrast to the quiet, ominous mist that shrouded them. "Ahead lies fortune or folly. If you don't have the steel for it, say so now." Silence answered, but the tension crackled in the air, tightening shoulders and clenching fists. Draven's crew was as ragged and determined as he was, men with scarred faces and jagged smiles, eyes as hard as the steel cutlasses at their hips. Among them, however, murmurs began to stir, a soft chorus of fears rising beneath the scrape of shifting boots and the groan of timbers. One of the deckhands, a young sailor named Talon, muttered under his breath, "They say the shadows move there, Captain. The island takes you in and never lets you leave." His fingers traced the edge of a small silver charm around his neck, his lips moving in silent prayer. "Before we set sail, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And if you were part of this crew, what role would you take on? The navigator, the lookout? Let's see who's brave enough to join this adventure." The fog thickened, casting eerie, twisting shapes that seemed to cling to the ship's hull, drawing ever closer. At the bow, Lena squinted into the murk, her grip on her dagger tight. She had followed Draven into countless scrapes before, narrow escapes from the British Navy, ambushes from rival pirates, and even a nightmarish skirmish with creatures said to belong to the deep. But nothing had felt like this. "Draven," she murmured, her voice low enough only he could hear. "There's something wrong. This fog, it doesn't feel natural. It's like it's watching us." The captain glanced at her, an amused gleam in his eye. "Aye, let it watch. If the shadows have eyes, they'll soon see why they should fear us." The Black Talon pushed on, the whispers of the crew swallowed by the heavy mist. An unnatural chill wrapped around them, and the hairs on every man's neck prickled. Suddenly a scream tore through the air, a lookout perched high above, calling from the crow's nest. "Land ho! Starboard side, no, wait, it's moving." The men squinted into the thick, shifting fog. Just visible through the mist was the outline of the island, looming like the carcass of a great beast. It seemed to writhe, its twisted trees and jagged cliffs shifting as though hiding from sight. "Steady!" Draven commanded, his voice fierce against the mounting dread. "We've come too far to turn back now." They rowed ashore under a blanket of silence, stepping foot on a beach that seemed untouched by time. The sand was black as ash, and the air hummed with a heavy, oppressive silence. All around them, the shadows deepened, moving with strange, unnatural grace. Draven felt a chill at the base of his spine, but his face betrayed nothing. He strode forward, leading his crew inland. Through thick, twisted vegetation and ancient statues with hollow eyes, they walked. Each step drew them deeper into a land that seemed to grow darker with each passing moment. Lena found herself whispering words of caution, but Draven dismissed them with a wave. His eyes gleamed with greed and determination, fixated on the stone archway that rose before them. The arch was carved with strange symbols, runes that seemed to writhe and pulse as if alive. Draven barely hesitated, pushing through it, but Lena felt a surge of unease. She glanced back at the crew, many of whom exchanged nervous glances and muttered oaths. The deeper they ventured, the more bizarre and unnatural the island became. Ancient pillars lay broken and overgrown, shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. They found skeletons scattered along their path, bones bleached white, lying in heaps as if cast aside by a giant hand. The crew's courage, once bolstered by the hope of riches, began to erode. "Captain," one of the older men, an experienced sailor with a face like a weathered cliff, murmured in fear. "I don't like this place. Feels cursed." "Then you're free to turn back," Draven said sharply, his gaze fixed ahead. "But any man who turns will find himself poorer by half. Riches like these demand courage." No one moved, bound as much by loyalty to their captain as by fear of what lay ahead. The air grew thick, heavy with an ancient stench, a scent that clawed at the back of their throats. Lena stayed close to Draven, her hand gripping the hilt of her dagger. Just as the island's heart came into view, a vast stone temple glimmering beneath the moonlight. A shadow moved across the entrance, blocking their way. Tall and gaunt, the figure was cloaked in darkness, his face obscured beneath a black hood. His voice, when it came, was hollow and ancient, a whisper echoing from the depths of the abyss. "Turn back," he intoned, his words dripping with menace. "This land is not for the living." Draven stepped forward, undeterred. "We'll take our chances, old man. Move, or I'll show you what happens to those who stand in the Raven's way." The figure laughed, a sound like gravel scraping in the silence. He raised a bony finger, pointing toward Draven. "You've already been marked, Raven of the Sea, and this land shall claim you, as it has all others." The crew stirred, glancing nervously at one another, but Draven held his ground, stepping forward, his jaw set with defiance. "Then let it try." As they pressed on, a subtle shift began to creep into the air, and the darkness grew heavier, denser with every step. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, moving without sound, growing bolder. The Isle of Shadows had welcomed them, but the price for such a visit would not be paid in gold. The crew pressed onward through the underbrush, the darkened forest clinging to them like a curse they couldn't shake. Shadows moved with unnatural grace, flickering just beyond sight, luring them further into the heart of the Isle of Shadows. Each step felt heavier, the weight of ancient curses thickening the air. Lena kept close to Captain Draven Silas, her instincts screaming caution, but his focus never wavered. His gaze was set on the black stone temple looming ahead, the ancient structure promising riches that no mortal hand had touched for centuries. A tense silence wrapped around the crew as they approached the temple's base. It was carved with the same writhing symbols as the archway they had passed, shapes that seemed to shimmer and twist, taunting their senses. These symbols, older than time itself, glowed faintly in the moonlight, casting a ghostly illumination on Draven's face. He reached out a hand to touch the cold carved stone, ignoring the murmured protests of his crew. Lena's voice was barely a whisper. "Draven, something's not right here. These symbols, they're not just marks, they're warnings." "Then let the dead warn the dead," Draven replied, his tone harsh. "We're here for treasure, Lena, not ghost stories." As they stepped inside the temple, a chill slithered down their spines. The air felt thick and unbreathable, as if it had been sealed in for centuries, waiting for foolish souls to dare its sanctity. Their lanterns flickered, casting shadows that seemed to grow and twist into nightmarish shapes. Lena gripped her dagger tighter, feeling her heart drum louder in her chest. The crew's resolve was waning, the once promised riches now a distant thought, eclipsed by the overwhelming dread crawling along their bones. The first room they entered was vast, with towering pillars and a domed ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. The walls were lined with carvings of battle scenes, figures locked in violent struggle, faces twisted in eternal agony. The crew shuffled closer together, the flickering light revealing countless eyes staring back at them from the ancient carvings, as though they too were alive, trapped in a stone prison, forever cursed to witness newcomers face the same doom. One of the younger crew members, Talon, stepped forward hesitantly, his voice trembling. These carvings, Captain. It's like they're watching us." Draven smirked, brushing off the creeping horror with a cold laugh. "Stone can't watch, lad. Keep moving. We're here for gold, not ghost tales." But as he spoke, a faint whisper echoed through the hall, carrying words that none could understand, yet all felt in their very bones. It sent chills down their spines, the sensation of invisible eyes piercing through them, measuring their worth. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the darkness and darted across the room. The men jumped back, weapons raised, but the figure was gone as quickly as it appeared. The room fell back into silence, the whispers of dread only growing louder within their minds. Draven scoffed. "Tricks and shadows," he muttered, though his eyes were fixed warily on the spot where the figure had vanished. "Let's keep moving." The crew obeyed reluctantly, casting wary glances at the walls and the unsettling darkness pooling in every corner. As they ventured deeper, Lena noticed something disturbing. Each room they passed through was lined with piles of bones, some arranged in strange, ritualistic patterns. Skulls stared up at them, empty sockets filled with an ancient malice. She suppressed a shiver, but her hands tightened on her dagger as a nagging suspicion grew in her mind. They were not the first to enter this place, nor, she feared, would they be the last to remain. As they reached the center of the temple, they found themselves in a vast chamber dominated by an altar. Upon it lay a massive stone chest, encrusted with jewels and inscribed with the same strange symbols they had seen outside. The treasure chest gleamed with a dark promise, and Draven's eyes lit up with greedy anticipation. "Finally," he murmured, stepping toward it. But before he could reach it, Lena grabbed his arm. "Draven, think," she hissed. "Everything about this place screams trap. Why would a treasure like this be left here for us to take?" Draven shrugged off her hand, his gaze locked on the chest. "You're too cautious, Lena. If you can't stomach the danger, you're welcome to turn back." But as he reached for the chest, the air grew cold, and the light in the room dimmed as though some unseen force had drawn in all the warmth and light, swallowing it into an abyss. The ground beneath them trembled, and a low, rumbling voice echoed through the chamber. "Those who seek to claim what is mine shall find only despair." The crew froze, their faces pale, their hands shaking. But Draven clenched his jaw, defiance burning in his eyes. He pried open the chest's lid, revealing piles of gold coins and gemstones glittering in the faint light. The men gasped, greed momentarily blinding them to the dark presence that seemed to settle over the room. But as the first of the crew reached for a handful of gold, a piercing scream tore through the chamber. Talon stumbled back, clutching his hand in pain as shadowy tendrils wrapped around his arm, dragging him toward the darkness. His face twisted in horror as he struggled, but his cries quickly faded, leaving only silence, and a crew paralyzed with terror. Lena's heart raced. She backed away, her gaze darting between the cursed chest and the dark corners where shadows seemed to writhe and pulse. The men had witnessed enough. They turned toward the exit, but as they did, the shadows closed in, blocking their escape. "We're trapped," one of the crew whispered, his voice barely a breath. "The island, it won't let us leave." Draven clenched his teeth, unwilling to concede to fear. "There's always a way out," he growled. "We'll burn our way through if we must." The men, rallying around his fierce resolve, brandished their weapons and held their lanterns high, preparing to face whatever darkness awaited. But the shadows only thickened, coalescing into forms, figures of men long dead, their eyes hollow and accusing, bound to guard the cursed treasure. The crew swung their swords, but each strike passed through the apparitions harmlessly. The ghosts reached out, cold and unyielding, and the crew was forced to retreat further into the temple, deeper into its heart, where escape grew more uncertain with every step. Lena's mind raced, desperate to find a way out. She remembered the map, the strange markings on it, and realized they might hold a clue. Ripping it from her belt, she unfolded it, searching for anything that could guide them. "What are you doing?" Draven snapped, his voice edged with frustration as he fought against the spectral forces. Shadows clawed at his arms, draining his strength, but he held his ground with sheer will. "These symbols, they're not just directions, Draven," Lena muttered, tracing a finger along the ancient script. "They're a spell, a binding. If we follow the path marked here, it might lead us out." Draven hesitated, the promise of treasure flickering in his eyes, but another scream. A sailor dragged into the shadows brought him back to his senses. He nodded sharply. "Lead the way." With Lena in the lead, the crew began a desperate, frantic journey back through the winding halls, following the cryptic symbols etched onto the walls and floor. The shadows clawed at them, relentless, but each step brought them closer to the path Lena had found. Draven and the remaining crew fought against the phantoms that lunged from the walls, their weapons useless against the spectral attackers. Only the symbols offered them any protection, flickering with a dim light that kept the shadows at bay as they moved forward. Just when escape seemed within reach, a figure blocked their path.
Hey there! Quick message. Grab a paper, write down. You Pirate. Our channel name. Come back soon. We've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
The same dark figure from the temple entrance, his face hidden, his form cloaked in shadows. His voice echoed through the halls, thick with ancient malice. "You may leave, but the island will follow. You are marked, Raven of the Sea. There will be no peace for those who desecrate my land." Draven stepped forward, defiant, but Lena held him back. "We have what we need, Draven," she whispered urgently. "Let it go. This treasure isn't worth the price." For the first time, Draven's resolve wavered. With a sharp nod, he turned away from the chest, leading his crew past the dark figure and toward the faint light that signaled their escape. As they emerged into the open air, they stumbled back to the Black Talon, barely escaping the island's clutches. But as the ship sailed away, the ominous fog closed in around them, lingering as a reminder. They had left the Isle of Shadows, but its curse had followed. The shadows were not done with them yet. The Black Talon cut through the dark waters, the ship moving at a breakneck pace as if driven by an unseen urgency. The crew huddled on deck, their faces pale and strained, eyes darting between the encroaching fog that clung to them like an omen. The Isle of Shadows was behind them, its cursed shore a distant memory, yet the cold dread of the place lingered, winding around their hearts like a tightening noose. Captain Draven Silas stood at the helm, jaw clenched, his gaze sharp on the mist stretching in every direction. He had faced storms, outwitted navies, and battled merciless pirates, but nothing had prepared him for the unnatural chill that now clung to his ship and his crew. Beside him, Lena Aris moved with equal tension, her hand never straying far from her dagger. She had led them out, deciphering the ancient markings, but a terrible feeling had rooted itself in her chest. The island had marked them. Every inch of her screamed that they had not escaped its curse. Night descended, blanketing the ship in thick darkness. Not a star dotted the sky. Even the moon hid its face. The crew whispered among themselves, voices hushed and filled with dread. Talon, his hand still throbbing from the burn he'd sustained in the temple, approached Lena, his face etched with fear. "It's following us, Miss Aris," he murmured, his voice quivering. "I can feel it, like ice crawling down my spine." Lena nodded, her gaze grim. She could feel it too. A presence, vast and malevolent, trailing their ship like a phantom. Shadows seemed to cling to the deck, swirling in and out of sight, leaving cold spots in their wake. Just as midnight struck, a low groaning sound echoed across the ship. The planks beneath their feet creaked and moaned, and the mist grew thicker, swirling in tight spirals around the masts, filling the sails with a strange, deathly calm. The shadows pooled at the edges of the deck, forming strange shapes, dark figures with hollow eyes and twisted forms. They were no longer just shadows. They had become something else. The crew backed away, swords drawn, though each man knew steel was useless against spirits. "Stand your ground!" Draven shouted, his voice rough but steady, rallying the crew. "This curse has no power over the brave. We'll fight it like any other enemy." But his words seemed hollow against the relentless whisper that filled the air, a voice like grinding stones that echoed from every corner of the ship. The crew covered their ears, but the whisper slipped through, burrowing into their minds, reminding them of the shadows waiting to drag them back to the island. "You cannot escape," the voice intoned, chilling the air and stilling every breath. "The mark of shadows clings to you, Raven of the Sea. Return, or be lost to the darkness." The ship lurched, tipping dangerously as unseen hands seemed to tug at the hull. Lena, her voice a fierce whisper, hissed at Draven. "We need to find a way to break the curse. The map, the symbols. We missed something." Draven gritted his teeth, nodding as his gaze darted across the fog-drenched deck. He'd spent his life chasing treasure, defying the odds, but now he faced an enemy he couldn't touch, couldn't see. With a sharp breath, he held out his hand, and Lena placed the map into it. They unrolled it, eyes scanning the strange symbols, searching for any clue that might lift the curse. The crew crowded around, their faces taut with hope and fear, watching as Draven's finger traced over the ancient script. Suddenly, Lena's eyes widened, her finger hovering over a symbol near the edge, a mark they hadn't noticed before. It resembled a binding knot, enclosed in a jagged circle, and beneath it, faint and nearly invisible, were the words, "To sever the shadow. Sacrifice must be given." Lena's gaze darkened. "A sacrifice," she muttered, glancing at Draven, the weight of the words settling over her. "The island. It demands something in return." The crew shifted uncomfortably, murmurs rippling through the men. No one dared to voice the truth they all sensed. The Isle's curse demanded a price. Draven's expression hardened as he took in the faces of his crew, men who had followed him into this madness. The silence grew heavy, broken only by the relentless whisper that seemed to surround them. As they pondered the meaning, a cold wind tore through the sails, and the shadows began to close in, creeping closer, dragging icy darkness in their wake. They circled the crew like predators stalking prey, pressing closer, filling the men with a deep, bone-chilling terror. Talon stumbled backward, his voice breaking as he screamed. "They're going to take us. They're here for all of us." "No!" Draven's voice boomed across the deck, laced with a fierce resolve. "Only one of us needs to stay. The rest will go free." Lena's gaze snapped to him, understanding dawning in her eyes. He intended to stay behind, to let the curse take him, but before she could speak, he held up a hand, stopping her. His face softened just for a moment, the weight of a lifetime of choices and the pursuit of treasure gleaming in his eyes. "This is my crew, Lena," he said quietly. "I led you here, and I'll see you get out." Draven turned, striding toward the center of the ship as the shadows coiled around him, recognizing his intent. The crew watched in horror and awe as their captain stood defiantly before the darkness. Lena's chest tightened, a fierce pain gripping her heart, but she knew Draven would never be swayed. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, his face a mask of determination as he faced the swirling shadows. "Take me," he shouted into the mist, his voice ringing with command. "I'm the one you want. Leave my crew and let them go free." The shadows paused, their shapes undulating like a sea of black flame. The voice returned, low and pleased. "You give yourself willingly, Raven of the Sea. The shadows will take you and your men will be free." Draven nodded, a single tear slipping from his stormy gaze, though his expression remained resolute. He turned to face his crew one last time, his gaze lingering on each of them before landing on Lena. "Get them home," he said, his voice a command and a plea. With that, the shadows surged forward, enveloping him in a wave of darkness. The crew watched, frozen as Draven's figure disappeared, his form dissolving into the mist. The darkness around the ship lifted, the fog dissipating, leaving only the calm sea and the first traces of dawn breaking the horizon. As the first light touched the deck, the men breathed out a collective sigh, but their faces were pale, and a deep sadness hung over them. Lena clutched the map, her heart heavy with the loss of their captain, a man who had sacrificed himself to break the curse. She stepped forward, taking her place at the helm, the weight of Draven's final words echoing in her mind. The Black Talon sailed away, her crew silent, the haunting memory of their captain's last stand fresh in their minds. Lena turned, casting one last glance at the distant Isle of Shadows, a solemn vow forming on her lips. "Your story won't be forgotten, Draven. The Raven of the Sea will be remembered." As the ship disappeared into the horizon, the shadowed isle returned to its eerie silence, waiting for the next souls brave or foolish enough to seek its cursed shores. But the curse had found a new anchor. Whispers would carry of a captain lost to shadows, bound to the isle, and sailors everywhere would know the tale of Draven Silas, a pirate who gave himself for his crew. The Black Talon sailed into open waters under a pale dawn, her crew quiet, each man wrapped in his own thoughts. The memories of the night's horrors lay heavy on their hearts. The ocean itself seemed subdued, as though paying respect to Captain Draven Silas, a man who had gambled his life to save his crew. Lena Aris stood at the helm, her hands steady but her gaze distant, locked on the horizon as if expecting the captain's voice to call out from the shadows, just one last time. The crew moved about with solemn efficiency, avoiding each other's eyes, the weight of their survival mixed with the sting of loss. Talon, still nursing the strange burn that had marked him during their encounter in the temple, approached Lena, his expression shadowed with a question he seemed almost afraid to voice. "Miss Aris," he began, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Do you think he's really gone? That he, a part of the shadows now?" Lena's jaw tightened, and for a moment she struggled with her answer. The memory of Draven's last, fierce gaze lingered in her mind, a look of defiance in the face of the abyss itself. She shook her head, her voice rough but steady. "Draven Silas was the raven of the sea, Talon. He may be gone, but he'll never be forgotten. Not by us, and not by the shadows that took him. Wherever he is, he'll find a way to haunt them." A few of the crew who overheard nodded in silent agreement, each man taking comfort in the idea that Draven's spirit remained unbroken, even if his body had been claimed by the darkness. The days stretched on, the Black Talon cutting through calm seas as they navigated back to Port Corazon. The men spoke little of the Isle of Shadows, each grappling with the memories in his own way. But as they drew nearer to port, a quiet determination settled over the ship, a vow shared by all who had survived. They would tell no one of the island's true horrors. For some secrets, they agreed, were best left buried in shadow, yet there were whispers. Word of the Raven of the Sea's disappearance spread quickly, the tale woven into hushed legends shared in smoky taverns and whispered over rum by sailors eager to tell of the cursed island. But none knew the full truth, only that the Raven had ventured where no one had returned from and vanished into the mist. Lena found herself haunted by those tales as they made port, and her resolve grew fiercer. She was Draven's chosen successor, and she would protect his legacy. The Raven of the Sea had not fallen in vain. His sacrifice would serve as a warning, a legend to deter others from seeking the Isle of Shadows. On their first night back in port, Lena gathered the crew in a dimly lit inn, a small room far from prying ears. The men huddled close, faces lit by the warm glow of lanterns, their expressions somber as she recounted Draven's final sacrifice. She spoke of the cursed island, of the shadows that took more than just treasure, and of Draven's defiant last stand. No man questioned her story. They had seen enough to know it was true. When she finished, Lena held up a battered, worn piece of parchment, the map to the Isle of Shadows. It lay silent and foreboding in her hands, an artifact of their haunting journey, yet something that had become as dangerous as the island itself. "This map," Lena said, her voice fierce, "is nothing but a curse. It's what led Draven to his end, and it'll take more if we let it. No more souls will be lost to that wretched place." With that, she tossed the map into the flames, the parchment crackling as it blackened and curled, the ancient symbols vanishing into ash. The men watched in silence, relief mingling with the shadows of their memories, and a weight seemed to lift from their shoulders as the last piece of their cursed journey dissolved. In the months that followed, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the Black Talon was never quite the same. The crew, bound by the memory of their captain's sacrifice, operated with a quiet reverence, each man more solemn, more vigilant. Lena commanded with the same sharp, steady hand Draven had trusted, her decisions tempered by the knowledge of what they'd faced together. Yet strange things began to happen. Rumors spread of ghostly lights seen at sea, of a shadowed figure glimpsed near the Isle of Shadows on foggy nights. Sailors returning from those waters whispered of a spectral ship that appeared in the mist, a black vessel with sails that seemed torn from the night itself, captained by a figure shrouded in darkness, his eyes like storm clouds, Some swore it was Draven Silas, the Raven of the Sea, who had escaped the clutches of the shadows, but remained bound to the island, cursed to guard its secrets for eternity. Others claimed it was his ghost, seeking vengeance on those who would dare to follow his path. Lena heard the tales in silence, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what had truly happened. She knew better than most that the sea held secrets far darker than any man could understand. But when asked if she believed the stories, she would only smile faintly, her gaze distant. "I don't know what's out there," she'd say, her voice soft. "But if it's Draven, then the shadows had better watch their backs." As she led her crew into new waters, their respect for her unbreakable, Lena carried Draven's legacy, a fierce and guiding flame that kept them steady through each storm. And though she never returned to the Isle of Shadows, she knew deep in her heart that the island remained out there waiting. The Raven of the Sea, bound to the shadows, would never rest. In the quiet of the nights, the Black Talon sailed on, her new captain watching the horizon with eyes as fierce as Draven's, prepared for whatever came next. The crew whispered of their adventures, of curses and treasures, of ghosts and shadows, and a tale that grew more fantastical with each telling. For those brave enough to listen, the legend of Captain Draven Silas became a warning, a tale of greed and courage, of sacrifice and fate. And in every port, those who heard it would nod knowingly, feeling a chill that lingered long after the story ended. If you dared to sail the shadows with us, subscribe and set sail with more tales of the high seas, mystery, and legend. Share this story with those who'd test their luck against curses and see what awaits you in the next adventure.